Space is rampant all over the world on this day of May 26, 1960. The big scientific expedition in the Japan Sea is ready for today's experiment. Thanks to American science, which makes it possible for us to have everything bigger, better, and quicker, a new atom bomb called 1361, because it is 1,361 times more powerful than the one that struck Hiroshima, will be tested. History-making moment.
Welcome to Our Nuclear Nightmares, a series examining the literature of the nuclear age. The following program contains material and themes that some listeners may find disturbing. Discretion is advised. Episode 7. Shadow on the Hearth. The year is 1949. The Soviet Union begins a mass deportation of people from the occupied Baltic states as a part of collectivization and to remove possible supporters of the Forest Brothers' resistance. The deportees, most of whom are women and children, are loaded onto trains at short notice, and over 4,000 died during transportation. Shukri al-Khoati, the first elected president of Syria who was instrumental in helping the nation gain independence from France, is ousted in a military coup by Husni al-Zaim. He is then ousted in a coup by Samni al-Hawani, who in turn is ousted in a coup by Abdid al-Shishakli, all within the space of a year. Due to the economic pressure of a ban of all exports from Eastern Bloc nations, the Soviet Union negotiates an end to its blockade of Berlin, which had lasted almost a year. During the blockade, an airlift organized by the United States saw more than 250,000 flights bring in almost 2.5 million tons of supplies. Don't Inhale It was written by Imre Balint and first published in the United States by Gare Associates. Don't Inhale It begins with the author addressing the reader, telling him about his smoking pipes and typical morning routine. The author then introduces the character of Sam Ting Lo Hung, who, besides having a patronizingly racist name, also has a concubine and makes his living as a doctor and a fisherman on the east coast of Korea. The author claims to know nothing about Korea before proceeding to describe the country as poor and the people as starving, ignorant, and dirty. After this brief introduction, Hung gets into his boat and sails out to go fishing. The next character introduced is Peter Keene, who lives in Long Island, a former Marine who works as a general contractor and is a member of the Lions, Moose, and Kiwanis clubs. Peter bids goodbye to his wife, Martha, who is described as a former beauty queen, and takes his boat on a short joyride while she goes to the local market. At the market, she picks up a newspaper that announces the disunited nations will be testing a new nuclear weapon that is magnitudes more powerful than the ones dropped on Hiroshima. The world is divided between the Soviet Union, where Stalin has died and been replaced by 3 men, Stalinsky, Stalinovich, and Stalinov, and the United States, where newspaper magnate Paul Hatch uses an editorial to effectively remove the president and put himself in charge. The first order Hatch gives is to have the Federal Bureau of Liquidation kill all communists, which also involves shuttering all trade unions, along with enforcing newspaper censorship. There is violence as people take advantage of the situation to enthusiastically murder anyone they suspect is a communist. Afterwards, Hatch flies out to the massive naval fleet that is set to observe the dropping of the huge nuclear bomb.
The great scientists near the boss on the bridge looked at each other apprehensively. The boss lowered his telescope, spat decisively into the ocean, glared accusingly at the scientists. "Gentlemen, where is your mushroom?" They did not answer. They still hoped that the mushroom, at least a tiny one like a bikini, might appear. But in about 10 minutes, when the red in the sky had disappeared, and the sky became clear and blue again, it was definitely established that there was to be no mushroom. The bomb was apparently a dud.
The scientists are unable to explain what happened to the angry Hatch. Unknown to them, the weapon has cracked the planet in 2, but the effects will not be noticed for a while. Despite the disappointment of the test, Hatch moves on to the second stage of his plan and orders the Navy towards Korea, China, and Siberia for a surprise visit, which is in actuality an invasion. However, Hatch is stunned when the city they see over the horizon is not a Soviet one, but in fact New York, and thinking he has gone crazy, asks to be institutionalized. The split, meanwhile, causes a giant wave that nearly drowns Dr. Hung, but he is saved by a carp that falls into his boat, and when the boat is capsized, he is able to hold on to it and reach the surface. He washes up on the shore where Martha, out looking for her husband, finds and carries him back to the house. There is more racism as Dr. Hung is described as being unfamiliar with either a modern bathroom or kitchen and has to be shown how to use the facilities. After the exhausting day, Dr. Hung falls asleep, while downstairs Martha and her son continue to argue, until she looks out the window and sees a volcano, which is hinted to be Mount Fuji. President Hatch, meanwhile, has been taken to a mental hospital, which is referred to as the Bug House, where telephones have been installed so he can continue to give orders. He is soon joined by the scientists who designed the bomb and who beg to be declared insane so they can escape the crowds who want to tear them to pieces. Hatch, wishing to improve his popularity and please the crowds, has several of the scientists thrown to their deaths from the top floor of the bug house. The novel then shifts to the Soviet fleet, which has been waiting to ambush the disunited nation's naval force, but after the bomb has been unable to locate them. The fleet tries to contact command at Vladivostok, but when they approach land, they are fired upon. They manage to put a force ashore, only to discover that they have invaded Quebec. The government of Canada panics and begs to be made into the 60th state of America in order to obtain military protection, to which President Hatch agrees. American troops pour into Canada, take control, and intercept the Soviet general commanding the invasion.
Yet there was an American city in the place where Vladivostok should have been, but that's as far as the general's thoughts got. He was hardly able to say 1, 2, 3 when a radar something like a huge magnet pulled his plane to the ground right on the airfield. The plane was promptly surrounded by Canadian officers ready to shoot, although they were just as bewildered as the general. General Gorinchkovich did not get out of the plane. He shook hands with his Russian escort and said, "Anyhow, long live Stalinovich, long live Stalinovsky, long live Stalinov." Of course, in Russian it sounded much better. He pulled out his revolver decorated with diamonds and rubies, a gift from his beloved Stalinov to be used on just such occasions, and shot himself.
The novel goes back in time a bit to describe what happened to Peter King, who, the moment he is out of sight of his wife, sails to a small island where a French-style hotel is located, and where he continues his affair with a woman named Teresa. After dallying with her, he gets back into his boat, where he is immediately hit by a wave similar to the one that nearly drowned Dr. Hung. This wave washes Peter onto a foreign shore where Mrs. Hung discovers him. When Peter wakes up, Mrs. Hung panics and runs back to the village to warn them of the odd-looking stranger. The villagers come down to the shore and use a cart to wheel Peter back to the village. Back in the present, the bug house has been transformed into a fully working alternative to the White House. President Hatch is briefed on the effects of the massive bomb which separated the planet into Earth 1, which turns clockwise, and Earth 2, which turns counterclockwise. The orbits of the respective Earths bring them close together every 28 days. As they get closer, a rumor spreads that the two Earths may collide, which makes people break out into a frenzy of sex, spending, and open expression. Once the Earths safely pass each other, the excitement ends and people return to business as usual. Martha becomes romantically attached to Dr. Hung and decides to marry him and divorce Peter, whom she knew was cheating. President Hatch grows tired of working at the bug house and moves the government back to Washington. He institutes a sweeping change in the political landscape, forcing a merger of the Democrats and Republicans into a single party that controls both the House and Senate. As a nod towards democracy, President Hatch has a surviving communist found and elected senator. The senator is roundly mocked when he starts demanding things like a free press, free speech, and a right to assembly. A radio station is set up to broadcast news, gossip, and other thinly veiled propaganda, along with music and a lot of advertising to Earth 2. Scientists develop a rocket system that can deliver items to Earth 2 and bring things back, including people. Meanwhile, Dr. Hung has become a successful doctor and popular lady killer, but he wants to escape from Martha and return to Korea. In Washington, the hundreds of diplomats marooned when the planet was split in half are given stipends and are treated as if they still represent their nations on Earth too. The diplomats use the money to build massive embassies and spend time arguing with each other. Tensions rise between the Norwegian and Hungarian embassies, with the staff starting to attack each other. They eventually declare war and radio messages back to their respective countries on Earth 2 to attack each other. The messages are ignored. The government in Washington, meanwhile, embarks on more authoritarian measures.
The next step was to outlaw the few socialists. This was a dirty trick because they had wholeheartedly voted with a majority not long ago to outlaw the communists and liberals. Now they too shed tears, but in vain. They enumerated all the magnificent services they had rendered in the past 50 years to help destroy the communists and liberals. But as one senator said, "It's happened before, not only in England but even in this country, that a social democrat today becomes a communist tomorrow. What's sure is sure. We don't want to take chances." And the socialists were outlawed.
This is followed by a law that defines all Jews as communists and subsequently outlaws them as well. The next law declares that all black people are foreigners and therefore are also outlawed. It should be noted that the book uses the term Negroes when it refers to black people. While this was common usage at the time of publication, it was then and still is now a derogatory racist term. The government also passes an amendment that sorts the population into 3 classes. The lower class is subjected to dozens of punitive laws that forces them to live in hovels far outside the cities and even strips them of their names. Meanwhile, President Hatch orders a private secretary who is chosen through a competition with a Miss Betty winning the prize. She is married off to President Hatch and is referred to afterwards as Shorthand. The book shifts to Earth 2, where the Western democracies, with assistance from the United Nations, unite to form a single political fascist government.
The diplomacy of the Western democracies, as the rest of the world called themselves, became day by day more and more entangled. So to cut the Gordian knot of millions of words, meanings and sub-meanings, political tactics, sub-tactics, contracts, subcontracts and counter-contracts, treaties and sub-treaties, the Western democracies organized and financed uprisings against the communists. The Western democracies had plenty of arms, which were more or less hidden, and armies too. The old Hitlerjugend, the werewolves in Germany, the Balalaikas in Italy, the White Stockingers in Austria, the Levantines in Hungary, the Iron Guardias in Romania, and so on and so on. The USA not only provided the ammunition, but signed the paycheck for these armies.
On Earth 1, Peter has married Dr. Hung's former concubine, Silver Pearl, and they've had a child together. He has also beaten up every man in the village and thereby become the chief. One of his first orders is for them to stop paying the moneylender whose usury has kept them in poverty. He also installs outhouses, creates an education system for the children, and makes the villagers work hard in a painful bit of seemingly unironic white man's burden. Things in the village improve so much that other villages ask for advice, and soon Peter is made president of Korea. The book moves back to Earth 2, where a business concern purchases Switzerland and turns it into a fortress. It becomes a haven for royalty, dignitaries, industrialists, and other 1% refugees, bringing with them huge piles of gold, jewels, and other valuable assets. They spend their time in entertainment, including a competition for the most scandalous behavior, all the while petitioning the American government to come save them. President Hatch orders a gigantic rocket to be built, large enough to fit hundreds of people and their wealth, which is fired into Switzerland every 28 days to retrieve the refugees and bring them back to New York City. The few who choose to stay behind in Switzerland live in luxury for a while, until the neighboring countries refuse to trade any further with them, and since no one is working, there is no food to eat. The starving rich decide to attack nearby villages, plundering, raping, and murdering to get what they want. The book shifts back to the White House, where Shorthand has begun to malinger, and doctor after doctor is brought in to try and cure her without success. Dr. Hung is called up and as part of his treatment sticks a needle into Shorthand's toe. This startles and angers her enough to drop a large vase on his head, killing him. Meanwhile, the countries of Earth 2 convene a League of Nations where a number of eccentric laws are passed on a variety of themes. Things on Earth 1 continue to deteriorate, with the people of the third class becoming desperate and the second class worried that they will become as poor as the third class. There are also new nations with significant uranium deposits that are developing weapons and building large militaries. In one of the new nations, Kuragray, the second class stages an uprising and hangs all the first class people from lampposts. This inspires the second class in other nations to revolt and hang their first class as well. It also inspires the third class to rise up and promptly hang the second class from the same lampposts. This panics President Hatch, who first orders all the lampposts in New York City be removed, and then sends a message to the southern nations demanding that they put the first class back in charge. The demand is refused, and Hatch fires over 1,000 nuclear missiles at the southern nations, who in turn fire back over 100 of their own.
1,372 atom bombs of all kinds and sizes were shot off to South America by self-propelled pilotless rockets with electronic eyes. All were shot off at 4:30 a.m. next day. And at 5:45 a.m., when it was reported that 117 Kuragay atom bombs had fallen on New Orleans, Dallas, Philadelphia, and a few other deserts, or rather made deserts of a few cities, the photographers were called into the boss's room to take a movie of him as, with a solemn face, he pushed a button.
In desperation, Hatch detonates another bomb similar to 1361, which splits Earth 1 in half, separating the southern and northern nations. Things settle down again until the single communist senator goes crazy on the Senate floor and is taken away and executed. As this leaves Earth 1 without an opposition, President Hatch makes half the senators Republicans and the other half Democrats. He also decides to create miniature European nations of Earth 2 for the refugees. The refugees build replicas of the Kremlin and Eiffel Tower, and dress up in their respective uniforms of their home nations. The splitting of the planet causes a recession that ruins the already poor third class, whom President Hatch orders to be massacred as a precaution. This, however, spurs the increasingly poor second class to rise up and decorate the remaining lampposts with first class people. President Hatch then uses another giant bomb to split Earth 1 again, a process that is repeated until there are dozens of Earths orbiting around the large Earth 2. Earth 2, meanwhile, has developed a modern political system and begins to reintegrate the Earth, figuratively and literally. However, when they try to bring back in the original Earth 1, which now only consists of New York City, They are fired upon by a wild-looking madman who turns out to be President Hatch, who leads a large cohort of equally mad first-class people. While earlier novels in the nuclear genre contain snippets of black humor, Don't Inhale It differs in that the entire piece is comedy. It launches with an absurdist fantastical edge, with the planet being split in two, and things becoming more ridiculous from there. It consciously ignores the horrors of a nuclear exchange. There are no descriptions of people dying in the blasts or from radiation, the latter of which is never even mentioned. The novel does, however, tap into an anxiety the public held about the increasing power of the nuclear weapons being developed. When this novel was published, the United States had detonated 5 more nuclear devices in Operation Crossroads and Operation Sandstone. Crossroads became infamous for the Baker test, an underwater detonation that created a massive water plume and subsequent cloud. The result was far more than the scientists had expected, so much so that the scheduled third test was cancelled. It's likely that the test in the novel was directly inspired by this catastrophe. The realization that the experts did not fully understand, and therefore could not fully control the weapons that they created, were sent a chill through the public. The realization that the experts did not fully understand, and therefore could not fully control the weapons that they had created, sent a chill through the public. It was clear that while scientists were claiming that nuclear testing was safe, they were proceeding despite a lack of data. There was a torrent of columns, letters, and speeches from around the country demanding that the government cease testing temporarily or even permanently, and to halt further development. There were concerns that as nuclear yields increased, the bombs could set off earthquakes or drastically affect weather patterns. 2 weeks after the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the mayor of Miami wrote President Truman, asking the government to use the bomb to disrupt hurricanes that threatened the coast. Miami had almost been wiped away by a hurricane in 1926 and suffered an anxious close call of the Labor Day hurricane in 1935. In 1946, the Weather Bureau was already receiving letters asking if the weather could be altered by atomic weapons. Some of this was an understandable concern that such an unprecedented force could have consequences, but much came from the pronouncements of other scientists. In 1946, Vincent Schaefer discovered the basic principles of cloud seeding, shooting liquid carbon dioxide into rain clouds to induce them to rain. This set off a race among other companies and inventors to find and test other methods for effectiveness. One of these people was Bernard Vonnegut, whose patent for an alternative method of seeding inspired his brother Kurt to write his famous novel Ice 9. Meanwhile, Schaefer's research partner, Irving Langmuir, went on to test other methods and make increasingly grandiose claims about the ability to alter the weather. These claims were breathlessly repeated by the newspapers and inspired hundreds of copycats who roamed the country, promising farmers and politicians they could bring rains to parched lands. Meanwhile, Langmuir used his influence to persuade the Department of Defense to create Project Cirrus. The project conducted numerous weather modifications to see if seeding could affect lightning storms or hurricanes. The latter would spark controversy when in 1947 it seeded Hurricane King with dry ice, after which it suddenly shifted track and hit Savannah, causing millions of damage and 1 death. While a study much later would hypothesize the shift was caused by a high-level ridge, at the time people understandably chose to believe human meddling had caused the disaster. This suspicion would soon encompass nuclear weapon testing as it increased throughout the 40s and 50s. In 1951, Nevada experienced one of the coldest years on record, and there was a belief that this had been caused by the Buster Jangle nuclear test series, enough that the state government called for the halt of all testing. In 1953, between June 7th and 9th, 50 tornadoes touched down across several thousand miles. 2 towns particularly hard hit were Beecher, Michigan and Worcester, Massachusetts. A combined 200 people were killed and 2,000 injured. In the aftermath, many of the victims blamed tests in Nevada for causing the weather. They were not alone. At the time, almost a third of the public believed the violent and unusual weather the United States was suffering from was due to nuclear tests. By now, people had started talking about atom weather, and the term began appearing in newspapers. In California, a farmers' association funded a commission to see if tests affected the climate. Their private science research was due to frustration with both the Atomic Energy Commission and the Weather Bureau, who flatly denied any connection between the weather and nuclear tests. However, they offered no proof. A weather satellite network and mainframes for simulation were decades away. In reality, the scientists knew little and instead relied on inductive reasoning for their conclusions. When the Weather Bureau finally caved to public pressure and conducted research in 1955, they refused to even come to a conclusion, stating the time frame of nuclear testing was too short for analysis. This pattern of denial, refusing to study race concerns, then claiming that there was insufficient evidence was a cause of mounting distrust between the public and the government that would only grow worse. In this vacuum, conspiracies abounded, and fiction writers often indulged in these to various degrees of seriousness. Countless short stories and comics featured nuclear weapons causing floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, and hurricanes. Some envision more fantastic possibilities, with the Earth's axial tilt being altered or knocked out of its orbit and sent into the sun or freezing deep space. The novel takes the idea a bit further by having the President of the United States blasting the planet into smaller and smaller pieces to isolate it from subversive elements. This satire, however, struggles under its framing device and inconsistent focus. Finding comedy in the nuclear age was difficult, especially well-crafted comedies such as in Dr. Strangelove and The Bed Sitting Room. The novel sometimes offers incisive commentary, particularly about the fascist sympathizers that remained in Europe after the war, and the way governments exploited social democrats to destroy socialist and communist movements. However, beyond that, the novel has no particular commentary, caustic or cynical, on the use of nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, it stands as an entry in nuclear age literature as the first novel making light of the end of the world. There is perhaps a dark joke to be found that while people feared the chance of a nuclear holocaust, going almost without notice was an article in a 1955 issue of Fortune magazine titled, quote, "Climate Warming in the Antarctic, 5-degree Rise over the Last Half-Century," unquote. If you found this episode interesting, entertaining, or a useful sleeping aid, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. This series is only possible through listener support. You can also help by leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify.